Hey everyone, I'm Lighthouse Keeper here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The Columbia River Bar had earned its nickname honestly. The graveyard of the Pacific stretched before Marcus Holloway in shades of gray and white, where the river's massive outflow collided with ocean swells in a perpetual war of water. From his vantage point inside Cape Disappointment Lighthouse, 65 feet above the rocks, he could see the bar's infamous breakers rolling in sets of 3, each one capable of flipping a fishing vessel or swallowing a kayaker without trace. The lighthouse keeper's log lay open on the desk before him, Sarah Chen's handwriting filling the final entries from 3 weeks ago. Her last words, written in increasingly erratic script, described something she'd seen in the water during a storm, something that shouldn't exist. Marcus set down his coffee mug, the ceramic clicking against the wooden desktop with a sound that echoed too loudly in the confined watchroom. The circular space felt smaller than it should, even with windows offering 360-degree views of the coastline. He'd arrived yesterday afternoon, transferred from his desk job at the Portland Coast Guard station to this temporary keeper position, while the investigation into Sarah's disappearance continued. His supervisor had presented it as a favor, a chance to clear his head after 18 months of mandatory counseling. Marcus knew better. They were moving him away from the water, giving him a lighthouse keeper's role that was mostly administrative now that the light itself operated automatically. A safe distance from the rescue operations that had broken something inside him. The November wind rattled the windows, carrying the taste of salt and something else, something organic and wrong, like the smell of a tide pool left too long in the sun. Marcus had grown up in Seattle, spent 4 years as a rescue swimmer, and knew every scent the Pacific could produce. This wasn't any of them. He turned his attention back to Sarah's notes, forcing himself to read past the scientific observations about wave patterns and water temperature. The marine biologist had been stationed here for a 6-month research project, studying the impact of warming waters on local seal populations. Her early entries were methodical, professional. Then 2 months in, the tone changed. November 2nd, saw something at the North Jetty during evening rounds, approximately 6 feet tall, humanoid shape, but wrong proportions, arms too long. Stood in the surf for 3 minutes before submerging. Water temperature 52 degrees Fahrenheit. No survival suit visible. Need to investigate further. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, the old familiar tension building in his chest. He'd spent the last year and a half learning to recognize the signs of an anxiety attack, the way his breathing would shallow and his hands would start to shake. Dr. Morrison had taught him grounding techniques. 5 things you can see. The lighthouse lens, dormant now but still beautiful. The Coast Guard station visible across the bay. The fishing boats heading out despite the weather warning. The scatter of Sarah's belongings, still waiting for someone to box them up. The photograph on the wall, black and white, showing lighthouse keepers from 1952 standing in front of this same tower. 4 things you can touch. The smooth wood of the desk, the rough wool of his Coast Guard sweater, the cold metal of the window frame, the paper of Sarah's journal slightly damp from the constant humidity. His breathing steadied. The tightness in his chest eased. He continued reading. November 5th. 3 more sightings. Same location. Same figure. Started reviewing historical records. Found references to similar observations dating back to 1856. Early lighthouse keepers called them draugr, plural of draugr. Old Norse word, undead sailors. Scandinavian fishermen who worked these waters in the 1800s brought the legends with them. Thought it was superstition? Not so sure anymore. Marcus stood, needing to move, and walked to the north-facing window. The jetty extended into the churning water like a broken finger, massive stones piled and mortared to create a barrier against the Pacific's fury. The Columbia River Bar was the most dangerous maritime entrance in North America, responsible for over 2,000 shipwrecks since records began. He'd studied the statistics during his Coast Guard training, learned about the standing waves that could reach 40 feet, the unpredictable currents where river met ocean, the fog that rolled in without warning and turned navigation instruments useless. A figure stood on the jetty. Marcus's breath caught. The person was too far away for details, just a dark shape against the gray stone. But something about the stance was wrong. Too still. Too straight. The wind should have been pushing them, making them adjust their balance, but they stood rigid as a post driven into the rock. He grabbed the binoculars from their hook, old Steiner military-grade optics that the Coast Guard had issued to the Lighthouse decades ago. Through the lenses, the figure resolved into something that made his stomach drop. The proportions were off, just as Sarah had written. The arms hung too low, reaching past where the knees should be. The head sat too far forward on the shoulders, and the posture suggested someone who'd been underwater too long, joints locked in rigor mortis. The face was turned toward the lighthouse, though at this distance Marcus couldn't make out features. Just a pale oval where a face should be. He lowered the binoculars, counted to 5, raised them again. The jetty was empty. The wind picked up, howling around the lighthouse tower with a sound like voices calling from underwater. Marcus set the binoculars down carefully, noting how his hands had started shaking again. He'd been here less than 24 hours. Sarah had lasted 2 months before whatever happened to her happened. He needed to be smart about this, methodical. That was what had kept him alive during rescue operations, the ability to think clearly when others panicked. His smartphone sat on the desk, screen dark. He picked it up, checked the signal. 1 bar, flickering. The lighthouse had Wi-Fi, but it was satellite-based and unreliable in bad weather. A storm was rolling in according to the morning forecast. He should call his supervisor, report what he'd seen. Except what had he seen? A person on a jetty who walked away while he blinked? That would go over well with the psych evaluation team. Marcus returned to Sarah's journal instead, flipping through pages filled with increasingly frantic observations. She'd started documenting patterns. The figures appeared most often during high tide, always near shipwreck sites. She'd cataloged 17 different locations around the Cape where drogger had been sighted, and overlaid them with historical wreck data. Every sighting corresponded to a ship that had gone down with casualties. The more deaths, the more frequent the appearances. November 18th. Found the source material. Cape Disappointment Museum has archives from early Scandinavian settlers. The drogger aren't random. They're the drowned, sailors who died violently in the water. Norse tradition says they returned because their bodies weren't properly burned, weren't given the funeral rites. They're trapped between death and life, and they're hungry. They want to drag the living down to join them. The old keepers knew. They left offerings at the jetty: fish, whiskey, coins. I found the remains of an altar under the North Rocks. Someone maintained it until at least 1995 based on the dates on the coins. Then it stopped. That's when the disappearances started. Marcus felt cold despite his sweater. Sarah had written this 16 days before she vanished. He flipped to the next entry. November 20th. They're getting bolder. One came up to the lighthouse door last night. I heard it scratching at the wood. Went down with a flashlight. The door was covered in seaweed and there were wet footprints leading up from the beach, but no footprints leading away. It's like whatever made them just dissolved back into the water. The smell was incredible. Dead fish and rot and something metallic like blood mixed with salt water. I called the Coast Guard, but by the time they arrived, everything had dried up. They think I'm losing it, maybe I am. But I know what I saw. The lighthouse door was directly below Marcus, 65 feet down the spiral staircase that wound through the tower's interior. He'd checked it this morning during his initial inspection. Found nothing unusual. Just thick wood and brass fittings, weathered by over a century of coastal exposure. Now he wondered what Sarah had felt, hearing something scratch at that door in the darkness, knowing she was alone with miles of empty coastline on either side. His phone buzzed. Text message from his supervisor, Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Kendall. Weather turning. Storm warning upgraded to severe. Stay inside tonight. Check in at Yo 600. Marcus typed back a confirmation, grateful for the excuse to remain in the lighthouse. The tower was solid concrete and brick, built in 1856 to withstand the worst the Pacific could throw at it. Whatever was out there, at least he'd have walls between them. The afternoon deteriorated into evening, gray light fading to black without any real transition. Marcus made coffee on the small electric kettle in the keeper's quarters, ate a protein bar that tasted like cardboard, and tried to focus on the maintenance logs he was supposed to review. The Lighthouse lens no longer required constant attention, automated systems handling the rotation and timing, but there were still backup generators to test, weather instruments to calibrate, and a dozen other small tasks that justified a keeper's presence. None of it held his attention. His gaze kept drifting to the north window and the darkness beyond. At 11 p.m., the storm arrived. Rain hammered against the windows with enough force to make them bow inward. Wind speeds hit 60 miles per hour, according to the weather station, gusting higher. The lighthouse groaned, old bones settling under pressure, and Marcus found himself counting the waves as they struck the rocks below. 1, 2, 3. A pause. Then another set. The rhythm should have been soothing, predictable, but instead it felt like a countdown to something inevitable. The scratching started at midnight. Marcus was in the keeper's quarters trying to read one of the old books left by previous inhabitants when he heard it. A scraping sound from far below, wood against wood, or maybe something harder. Fingernails, his mind suggested, and he pushed the thought away. It was probably branches from the stunted shore pines that grew around the lighthouse base, blown by the wind and dragging against the structure. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It moved up the tower's exterior, following the spiral path of the interior staircase, as if whatever made the sound was climbing the outside of the lighthouse itself. Marcus stood, coffee mug forgotten, and moved to the window. He could see nothing in the rain-swept darkness, just his own reflection staring back with wide eyes. Then he smelled it. The same wrong smell from this morning, but stronger now. Dead things and salt water and something underneath that reminded him of the morgue where they'd taken the bodies after the fishing boat incident. The incident that had ended his career as a rescue swimmer, that still filled his dreams with the image of a child's face underwater, eyes open but seeing nothing, too far gone by the time he'd reached them. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear his own breathing, too fast, too shallow. He forced himself to walk to the door of the watchroom, to look down the spiral staircase that descended through the lighthouse's core. The stairs were metal, their surfaces worn smooth by over a century of footsteps, and they vanished into darkness below. The emergency lights, which should have illuminated the path, were dark. He flicked the switch next to the door. Nothing. Either the storm had killed the backup power or something else was wrong. Marcus retrieved his flashlight from the keeper's quarters, a heavy mag light that had been his constant companion during night rescues. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. He started down the stairs, playing the beam along the metal steps and concrete walls. The lighthouse interior was circular, each level marked by small windows that during the day let in enough light to navigate by. Now they were just black squares, offering no illumination. His footsteps echoed wrongly, as if the space was both larger and smaller than it should be. At the third landing, his flashlight caught something on the wall. He stopped, heart hammering, and directed the beam at the concrete. Seaweed, fresh and dripping, plastered against the interior surface in long strands. But that was impossible. This level was 30 feet above the highest storm surge. No wave could reach here. Marcus touched it carefully, half expecting it to move. The seaweed was cold and slimy, real enough, and when he pulled his hand away, his fingers came back stinking of decay. The scratching started again, now from below him. Closer. He should go back up, he knew that. Lock himself in the watchroom and wait for daylight. Instead, he continued down, driven by something he didn't want to examine too closely. Maybe it was the need to prove to himself that he wasn't losing his mind. Maybe it was the same compulsion that had driven Sarah to keep investigating until she vanished. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he was just tired of being afraid. The main door of the lighthouse was at ground level, accessible by a small entrance room that also held cleaning supplies and emergency equipment. Marcus reached it after what felt like an hour, but was probably only 2 minutes. The door itself was thick wood, reinforced with brass, designed to withstand storms and forced entry. It stood closed, but the floor around it was covered in water, not just damp but actually pooled, as if someone had thrown buckets of seawater against the door hard enough to force it through the cracks. And in the water, footprints, bare feet, pale against the dark concrete, heading from the door toward the stairs, toward him, but not walking. The stride was too long, the prints too evenly spaced. Whatever had made them had been moving at an impossible pace, covering 8 feet with each step. The prints stopped at the base of the staircase where Marcus stood, as if whatever had made them was now standing exactly where he stood. He aimed his flashlight down at his own feet, just his boots, standard Coast Guard issue, and wet concrete. No other prints. But when he looked back at the door, he saw them again. Fresh prints, still glistening, leading from the door to the stairs. They hadn't been there a second ago. Now they were. The scratching came from behind him, above him. From the staircase he'd just descended. Marcus spun, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and saw nothing. Just metal stairs and concrete walls. But the smell had grown overpowering, and he could hear something that might have been breathing, or might have been water dripping, or might have been the sound of sodden lungs trying to pull in air. He ran. Not thinking about it, not analyzing the decision, just moving on pure instinct. Back up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, flashlight bouncing crazily as he climbed. Behind him, the breathing sound grew louder, and he could hear wet footsteps on the metal stairs. Not running, not hurrying, just following with the patient pace of something that had all the time in the world. Marcus burst into the watchroom and slammed the door, throwing the bolt. The door was metal, installed in the 1970s as a fire safety measure, and it should have made him feel secure. Instead, he just felt trapped. He backed away from it, flashlight still pointed at the door as if the beam could somehow protect him. The scratching started again, now on the metal instead of wood, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard amplified 100 times. Then it stopped. Silence rushed in, broken only by the storm outside and Marcus's own ragged breathing. He waited, counting seconds, muscles tensed for something to burst through the door. Nothing happened. 5 minutes passed. 10. His breathing slowed. His rational mind started reasserting itself, offering explanations. Auditory hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation. The footprints could have been watermarks from his own boots, seen from the wrong angle. The seaweed might have been there for days. He was making connections that didn't exist, just like Sarah had, except Sarah had disappeared. That wasn't a hallucination. Marcus returned to her journal, reading by flashlight since the power was still out. He found the entry he was looking for near the end, dated November 28th, 2 days before she vanished. I understand now, the Draugr aren't monsters, they're victims. They died violently without warning, and they're trying to communicate. The scratching, the appearances, it's not aggression, it's desperation. They want someone to acknowledge what happened to them, to remember. I found the passenger list from the SS Rosecrans, the steamship that went down in 1913, 253 souls lost. Their bodies were never recovered. They're still out there, still trapped in the water where they died. The Draugr are showing themselves to me because I'm the first person in decades who's actually paying attention. Tomorrow I'm going to the wreck site at low tide. There's something they want me to find. There was no entry for November 29th. Sarah had disappeared on November 30th. The Coast Guard had searched for 3 days before calling it off, concluding she'd likely been swept into the water during her investigation and drowned. Her body hadn't been recovered. Marcus thought about that now, about another person added to the graveyard of the Pacific's count, another soul lost to the water. And if Sarah was right, if the Draugr were the drowned returning, then what would she be now? The storm intensified, wind screaming around the lighthouse with a sound that was almost human. Marcus made himself coffee with bottled water from the emergency supplies, not trusting the tap. His hands shook as he poured, spilling grounds across the counter. He needed to stay awake. Something about the darkness felt dangerous, as if sleeping would leave him vulnerable to things that moved in the space between consciousness and dreams. At 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. Text message, despite the storm. He picked it up, expecting something from Chief Kendall. The number was unknown. The message read, "Under the North Jetty, the altar, they need the rights." Marcus stared at the screen until it went dark, then lit it up again. The message was still there. He checked the send time. 3:07 a.m., 2 minutes ago. He tried to call the number back. It rang once, then connected to a sound like static and water and something underneath that might have been voices. He hung up quickly, pulse racing. Who would text him at 3 in the morning? Who even had his number except Coast Guard personnel and Dr. Morrison? Sarah. Sarah had his number. He'd given it to her successor, left it in the Lighthouse records as an emergency contact since he'd been temporarily assigned to the Portland station. But Sarah was gone. Sarah was dead, even if they hadn't found her body. Unless... Marcus looked at the north window. The storm had eased slightly, rain falling straight down now instead of being driven horizontally by the wind. Through the darkness, he could just make out the jetty, a black line against the marginally less black water. He thought about what Sarah had written, about the altar under the North Rocks, about offerings, about funeral rites that hadn't been performed. He thought about 253 people dying in the water, sudden and violent, trapped forever in the moment of their death. He thought about the child in the fishing boat, the one he'd reached too late, and how that death had broken something in him. And he thought about what Dr. Morrison had said during their last session. Sometimes the only way through trauma is to face it directly, to acknowledge the pain instead of running from it. Marcus made a decision he knew was probably insane. He retrieved his cold weather gear from the keeper's quarters, pulling on waterproof pants and a heavy jacket, boots with good tread. He grabbed the emergency kit, a waterproof bag containing flares, first aid supplies, and emergency rations. Then he took something else, something he found in one of the storage lockers, a bottle of whiskey, old and unlabeled, left by some previous keeper, and a box of waterproof matches. The descent down the lighthouse stairs was worse the second time. He knew what might be waiting in the darkness, and his flashlight beam seemed inadequate against the weight of the shadows. The seaweed was still on the wall, but now there was more of it, trailing down from the upper levels like some kind of growth. The smell was overpowering, forcing him to breathe through his mouth. He kept his eyes forward, not looking at the walls too carefully, afraid of what else he might see. The main door was still surrounded by water, the pooled seawater deeper now. It reached halfway up his boots as he waded through it to unlock the door. The wind caught it immediately, slamming it open against the exterior wall with a crack like a gunshot. Marcus forced his way outside, into rain that felt like needles against his exposed face. The path to the jetty was treacherous, rocks slick with rain and seaweed. The tide was out, exposing sections of the jetty's foundation that were normally underwater. Marcus climbed carefully, using his flashlight to pick out safe handholds. The beam caught something moving in the water below, something that rolled and surfaced before diving again. Too large for a seal, wrong shape for a shark. He didn't look at it directly, couldn't afford to, not when one slip would send him tumbling into the rocks below. The north side of the jetty was partially sheltered from the wind, and he found what Sarah must have found. A gap between the massive foundation stones large enough to crawl into if you were desperate or determined. The flashlight beam revealed a space beyond, dry enough that it had clearly been used before. Marcus squeezed through, scraping his shoulders on the barnacle-covered rock. The altar was exactly as Sarah had described, a flat stone, carefully positioned, surrounded by the remains of old offerings. Coins green with verdigris, bottles worn smooth by salt and sand, scraps of cloth that had once been flags or clothing, and bones, small ones, from fish or birds, some larger ones that Marcus didn't examine too closely. The whole arrangement had a deliberate quality to it, the kind of setup that spoke of ritual and tradition maintained over generations. Marcus set down his emergency bag and pulled out the whiskey. His hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time. From cold, or maybe from something else. Something that felt like anticipation. He opened the bottle, the seal cracking with a sound that echoed in the small space. He poured whiskey over the altar, watching it darken the stone and pool in the carved depressions. He didn't know the proper words, the old Norse incantations that the original keepers would have used, so he used his own. "I remember you," he said, voice rough from salt spray and emotion. "The SS Rosecrans, 253 people, lost January 7th, 1913. You weren't forgotten. I'm here to say that. You weren't forgotten." He continued, listing other ships. The SS Delwood, lost in 1929. The fishing boat Isabel, gone in 1949. He named every wreck he could remember from his Coast Guard training, every vessel that had gone down on the Columbia River bar. And then, because it mattered, because it had been eating at him for 18 months, he named the fishing boat from his last rescue. The one where he'd been too late. The one with the child. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice broke. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you all. I'm sorry you died alone in the water. I'm sorry no one performed the rites. I'm sorry." The wind died, not gradually but instantly, as if someone had closed a door. The sudden silence was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the whiskey still dripping from the altar stone. He raised his head slowly, flashlight beam cutting across the space. They were there, not one or two, but dozens. Figures standing in the water beyond the jetty, visible now that the rain had stopped. Pale and wrong, with those two long arms and forward-leaning postures. They didn't move, didn't approach, just stood in the surf, watching. Marcus stood, legs trembling, and lit one of the matches. The flame caught on the whiskey-soaked cloth he'd placed on the altar, burning blue and green from the salt and alcohol, the traditional funeral fire, or as close as he could manage. He should have been terrified. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sadness, looking at all those figures. All those people who died suddenly, violently, without anyone to mourn them properly. One figure was closer than the others. Smaller, standing in the shadow of the jetty where the light barely reached. It took Marcus a moment to recognize the torn jacket, the build, the way she stood with her weight on her left leg because her right knee had an old injury from a climbing accident. Sarah Chen, or what was left of her. Her face was pale and bloated, eyes clouded white, but he knew her. And she was trying to speak, lips moving soundlessly in a message he couldn't hear. Marcus took a step toward her, then another. The other figures didn't move, but Sarah raised one hand, those two long fingers extended. Not reaching for him, he realized, pointing, back toward the lighthouse, back toward safety. She was trying to warn him, to tell him to go. "I'm sorry," Marcus said again, this time to her specifically. "I understand now. You were trying to help them. You were trying to give them what they needed." Sarah's expression didn't change, couldn't change, but something in her posture eased. The tension left those elongated limbs. She took one step backward, then another, moving deeper into the water. The other figures began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone. Not disappeared, just released, finally allowed to leave. The fire on the altar burned down to embers, then went out. Marcus stood alone in the darkness, listening to the sound of waves against rock. The smell was gone. The wrong feeling in the air was gone. There was just the ocean, ancient and indifferent, and a small altar that would need regular maintenance if it was going to continue doing its job. Marcus climbed back up to the lighthouse as dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pale gold. His phone had signal again, and there was a message from Chief Kendall asking him to check in. He sent back a brief report. Storm damage minimal. All systems operational. He'd file the longer report later, the one that wouldn't mention Draugr or altars or the dead returning. The lighthouse stood solid around him, and Marcus realized something had changed. The constant anxiety that had plagued him for 18 months, the feeling of drowning on dry land, had eased, not disappeared. He'd always carry the memory of that child in the fishing boat, but he'd done what he could. He'd acknowledged the dead. He'd remembered them. Maybe that was enough. Over the following days, Marcus fell into a routine. He maintained the lighthouse equipment, filed weather reports, kept the logs up to date. And every evening at dusk, he walked down to the jetty with an offering, sometimes whiskey, sometimes flowers from the stunted plants that grew in the rocky soil, sometimes just words, names of the drowned remembered and spoken aloud. The figures didn't appear again, not that he could see, but sometimes in the early morning, he'd find things by the altar, a worn coin, a smooth stone, small gifts from the ocean, left by currents or by something else. The Coast Guard eventually sent a permanent replacement, a young keeper named Thompson, who was enthusiastic about lighthouse history and didn't mind the isolation. Marcus briefed him on the equipment, showed him how to maintain the systems, and left Sarah's journal in the keeper's quarters where Thompson would find it. Some knowledge needed to be passed on. Some traditions had to be maintained. Before he left, Marcus made one final trip to the jetty. The altar was as he'd left it, clean and ready for the next offering. He added a new coin, polished and bright, and spoke the names one more time. The names of the Rosecrans crew, the names of Sarah Chen, the name of the child he couldn't save. The ocean rolled in sets of 3, eternal and patient, and Marcus listened to its voice. "Thank you," he said, not sure who he was thanking. The Draugr, maybe, for showing him that grief could be honored without destroying you. Sarah, for her courage in investigating what others dismissed as madness. Or maybe himself, for finally being willing to face what he'd been running from. The drive back to Portland took 3 hours, following the Columbia River inland through forests of Douglas fir and Sitka spruce. Marcus kept his phone on, checking it periodically for messages. Nothing unusual appeared. No texts from unknown numbers, no voices in the static. Just the normal flow of Coast Guard communications and messages from Dr. Morrison confirming their next appointment. But that night, in his apartment with city lights visible through the windows and traffic sounds drifting up from the street below, Marcus dreamed of the ocean, not the nightmare version that had haunted him for 18 months, all drowning and helplessness and children's faces underwater. This was different. He stood on the jetty at Cape Disappointment, dawn breaking over the Pacific, and the water was full of lights. Not Draugr, not the dead. Just lights, blue and green and gold, moving in patterns like schools of fish, or maybe like something else. Something peaceful. Something that had found rest after years of searching. He woke with salt spray on his lips, though his windows were closed. And when he checked his phone, there was a single message from an unknown number. Just 2 words. "Thank you." Marcus deleted the message, showered, made coffee, and prepared for another day. But before he left for his shift at the Portland station, he added a new task to his calendar. Every month on the 7th, the anniversary of the Rosecrans sinking, he'd return to Cape Disappointment. He'd maintain the altar. He'd speak the names. He'd remember the drowned. It was the least he could do. The ocean never forgot its dead. Maybe it was time people didn't either. The Columbia River Bar continued its eternal work, where fresh water met salt and the geography of the coastline created conditions that had claimed over 2,000 vessels since records began. Fishermen still vanished, boats still went down in storms, and the sea still took what it wanted without asking permission. But the altar under the North Jetty was maintained now, regularly tended, offerings left by those who knew. The old traditions had been revived, passed from keeper to keeper like a sacred trust. And if ships passing Cape Disappointment at night sometimes reported strange lights in the water, or if fishermen occasionally claimed to see figures standing on the jetty during storms, well, that was just the graveyard of the Pacific being itself. Some places were thin, they said, some waters remembered, and some dead, properly honored, could finally rest. Marcus Holloway returned to rescue swimmer duty 6 months later, cleared by Dr. Morrison and his superiors. He saved 3 people from a capsized yacht that summer, pulled them from water so cold it should have killed them in minutes. And when he dove into the dark water, feeling the ocean close around him like a fist, he felt something else there too. A presence, watching. Not threatening, just observing, making sure he came back up. The child he'd failed to save was gone, really gone. But the ocean remembered. And sometimes when things remembered correctly, when the proper respects were paid and the old ways honored, even tragedy could transform into something else. Not healing exactly, but acknowledgement, witness, the assurance that the dead mattered, that their stories wouldn't be forgotten, that someone would speak their names when the tide went out and the ancient altars stood revealed. Cape Disappointment. Lighthouse still operates, its light sweeping across the bar every 10 seconds, warning vessels away from the rocks, where so many have foundered. And beneath it, in the space between the foundation stones, the altar waits, ready for the next offering, ready for the next keeper who understands that some duties extend beyond the maintenance of lights and the filing of reports. Some responsibilities are older than the Coast Guard, older than the United States itself, running back to the first sailors who challenged the ocean and learned its price. The water remembers, the drowned remember, and now, at last, someone remembers them. The Columbia River met the Pacific Ocean with the violence of two gods at war, and Marcus Holloway stood at the edge of that ancient battlefield, watching fog roll across the water like the breath of something vast and patient. Cape Disappointment light rose behind him, its white tower stark against the gray November sky, and he could feel the weight of it already, not just the structure itself, but everything it represented. Isolation, duty, the kind of solitude that either healed a man or finished breaking him. He'd driven 12 hours from Portland with nothing but a duffel bag and the letter from the Coast Guard Auxiliary. Temporary keeper needed, 4-month assignment, previous keeper no longer available. The phrasing had been deliberately vague, but Marcus had made calls. Daniel Cortez, the last keeper, had disappeared 6 months ago. Not died, not quit, disappeared. His boat had been found drifting 3 miles offshore, engine running, coffee still warm in the thermos. No body, no note, no explanation. Marcus pressed his thumb against the scar on his left palm, a habit he'd developed after Astoria. After the fishing vessel that capsized in 40-foot swells. After he'd gone down 3 times and come up twice with survivors. After the 3rd time when he'd come up with nothing but salt water in his lungs, and the memory of a hand slipping from his grip. The hand had belonged to a 16-year-old kid named Tommy Westbrook, and Marcus could still feel the exact texture of the boy's waterlogged jacket sliding through his fingers. The Coast Guard had called it a heroic effort. Marcus called it what it was, failure dressed up in official language. They'd given him a medical discharge for the psychological trauma, a pension, and suggestions for therapists he'd never visited. What they hadn't given him was a way to sleep through the night without hearing Tommy's mother screaming on the dock. So when the email came about Cape Disappointment, he'd responded within an hour. The Lighthouse needed someone. He needed to be needed. And maybe, somewhere in the intersection of those two facts, there was something resembling redemption. The key to the keeper's house was under a rock shaped like a fist, exactly where the district coordinator had said it would be. The house was a modest structure adjacent to the tower, built in 1973 when they'd automated the light but still needed occasional human presence. Marcus pushed open the door and was immediately struck by how lived in it felt. Daniel Cortez had left everything behind. Dishes in the drainer, a jacket on the hook, boots by the door arranged in careful parallel. It looked like the man had stepped out for groceries and never come back. The personal effects should have been removed months ago. Marcus knew that, but there was a particular bureaucratic inertia that came with unexplained disappearances. Until Daniel was officially declared dead, his possessions remained in a strange legal limbo, untouched and untouchable. Marcus had been told to leave everything as he found it. He dropped his duffel on the couch and moved through the house slowly, cataloging. The kitchenette held basics: canned soup, instant coffee, a half-empty bottle of Jim Beam. The bathroom was clean but showed signs of hard water staining the fixtures. The bedroom contained a narrow bed, a dresser, and a nightstand with a lamp that still worked when Marcus tested it. Everything was ordinary. Everything was wrong. It wasn't any one thing he could name. It was the way the air felt too still, too thick. The way dust had settled in strange patterns on the windowsills, as if something had been moving through the rooms after Daniel left, but before Marcus arrived. The way the floorboards creaked under his weight with a rhythm that sounded almost like speech. Marcus shook his head, irritated with himself. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had made the therapists look at him with concern. Pattern recognition run amok. The human brain's desperate attempt to find meaning in randomness. He knew the technical terms. He'd read the pamphlets. He found Daniel's journal in the drawer of the nightstand, tucked beneath a Bible that looked like it had never been opened. The journal was one of those leather-bound notebooks you could buy at any bookstore, thick and substantial. The leather was warped and stiff, and when Marcus opened it, he understood why. Water damage. The pages were wrinkled and discolored, the ink bleeding in places, but still legible. The first entries were mundane. Weather observations, maintenance notes, a grocery list. Daniel had been at Cape Disappointment for 2 years before he vanished, and for most of that time his writing reflected the comfortable routine of a man who'd found his place in the world. He wrote about fixing the diesel generator, about watching gray whales migrate south, about the pleasure of a hot meal after a day of work in the cold wind. Then, 3 months before his disappearance, the tone shifted. November 8th. Something washed up on the rocks below the North Point. Looked like driftwood from a distance, but when I climbed down to check, I could see it was part of a ship's timber. Old. Really old. The wood was almost black, and when I touched it, it was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Brought it back to the house. Probably shouldn't have. There are symbols carved into it. Not anything I recognize. Not English. Not Spanish. Something older. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. He turned the page. November 12th. Keep hearing things at night. Knocking sounds on the tower door. Scratching on the windows. I know it's just the wind, just branches or debris, but my body doesn't believe what my brain is telling it. Last night I got up 3 times to check the locks. Everything secure, everything fine. But I can feel eyes on me when I'm out doing the lamp check. The kind of watching that makes your skin crawl. November 19th. Saw a man standing on the rocks at low tide this morning, just standing there completely still facing the lighthouse. I watched him for 20 minutes. He never moved, never turned his head. The tide was coming in and the water was rising around him, and he just stood there. I went to get binoculars, and when I came back, he was gone. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there at all. November 24th. Did some research on that timber. Think it might be from the Vandalia, Navy sloop that wrecked here in 1853. All hands lost. They never recovered most of the bodies. The locals have stories about that wreck. Stories I wish I hadn't read. The old-timers around here, the ones whose families go back generations, they have a name for the drowned sailors who don't stay drowned. They call them gengangere, Norwegian word, the walking again. My grandmother used to tell stories about draugar, dead men who walk the shore looking for the living to drag down with them. I always thought they were just fairy tales, warnings to keep children away from the water. Now I'm not so sure. Marcus closed the journal and stood up abruptly, moving to the window. The light was fading, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that seemed to press down on the ocean. He could see the rocks Daniel had written about, dark shapes jutting from the foam where the Columbia met the Pacific. The confluence created standing waves 15 feet high on bad days, ship-killing water that had earned this stretch of coast its nickname, the graveyard of the Pacific. More than 2,000 vessels had gone down in these waters, countless lives lost. And according to Daniel's journal, at least some of them hadn't stayed lost. Marcus wanted to dismiss it, wanted to attribute the entries to isolation, to the kind of cabin fever that could make anyone see things that weren't there. He understood that particular madness intimately. But there was something about Daniel's writing, a progression from skepticism to reluctant acceptance to barely controlled terror, that felt authentic in a way that pure delusion never did. He spent the rest of the afternoon familiarizing himself with the equipment, The lighthouse itself was automated, but the keeper's presence was necessary for maintenance and emergency situations. Marcus checked the VHF radio, tested the backup generator, and made sure the first aid supplies were current. Everything was in order. Daniel had been meticulous right up until whatever happened to him happened. As darkness fell, Marcus made dinner from cans, beef stew that tasted like aluminum and salt. He ate mechanically, watching through the window as the lighthouse beam began its rotation. Every 8 seconds, the light swept across the water, illuminating white foam and black rocks and nothing else. Every 8 seconds, the darkness returned. He tried to read but couldn't focus. Tried to sleep but lay awake listening to the house settle around him, every creak and groan magnified by the silence. The wind picked up around midnight, and with it came sounds he couldn't quite identify. Rhythmic thumping that might have been loose siding or might have been something else. Scratching that could have been branches against glass or could have been fingernails. At 2 a.m. he gave up on sleep and went outside. The cold hit him immediately, wind cutting through his jacket and stealing his breath. The lighthouse beam turned overhead, casting his shadow long and distorted across the ground. Marcus walked toward the tower, keyring jangling in his hand, and that's when he saw it. Footprints in the mud near the tower door. Bare footprints. Fresh. His heart rate spiked, adrenaline flooding his system with the familiar cocktail of chemicals he'd come to know intimately during his Coast Guard years. Fight or flight. His body preparing for violence. But this was different from rescue work. This was the prey response, not the predator. He was the one being hunted. Marcus knelt beside the prints, pulling out his phone for the flashlight. The prints were adult-sized, male probably, the toes clearly defined in the soft earth. What stopped his breath wasn't their presence. Trespassers, while unlikely, weren't impossible. What stopped his breath was the water pooling in the depressions. Seawater. He could smell the salt and decay, could see small fragments of kelp pressed into the mud. He stood slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of his light. The beam from the lighthouse swept past, illuminating nothing but wind-bent grass and jagged rocks. Swept past again. And on the third rotation, Marcus saw him. A man standing at the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 yards away, completely motionless, completely naked, skin that looked gray in the lighthouse beam, though that might have been the quality of the light. The figure didn't move as Marcus stared, didn't react when Marcus called out, just stood there with arms at his sides facing the ocean. Then the light rotated away, and when it came back, the figure was gone. Marcus ran, not toward where the figure had been, but back to the keeper's house, his rational mind screaming at his lizard brain that running was stupid, that he needed to investigate, that there was probably a simple explanation. But his body wasn't interested in rational thought. His body remembered the weight of dead men in the water, the way they moved in the current like something still alive, the wrong flexibility of drowned limbs. He locked the door behind him and stood in the kitchen, breathing hard. Then he grabbed Daniel's journal and flipped to the last entry. December 1st. They come every night now. More of them. I counted 7 last night. They stand in a circle around the lighthouse just beyond where the light reaches, waiting. I know what they want. I've known since I found that timber. The Vandalia went down because the captain ignored the warnings. There was a Norwegian sailor on board who said the waters here were cursed, that the drogger walked the shore and dragged down any ship that came too close. The captain laughed at him, called him superstitious, threw him in the brig, and when the ship foundered on the rocks, that Norwegian sailor was the first one to drown. His name was Olaf Christensen, and according to the ship's log, he screamed all the way down that his people's gods would make the captain pay for his arrogance, that the drowned would walk until the debt was settled. I think the debt is us. Everyone who comes to this lighthouse. Everyone who tries to light the way through waters that should be left dark. I'm leaving tomorrow. Not telling anyone. Just going. If I can make it to my truck. If I can get far enough away before they realize I'm gone. Maybe I can... The entry ended there. Not with a period or a dash, but mid-sentence, as if Daniel had been interrupted. Or taken. Marcus felt his hands trembling. He set the journal down carefully, aware that he was one bad decision away from getting in his truck and driving straight back to Portland. But something stopped him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the stubborn part of him that had kept diving in Astoria long after his body was screaming for air. Maybe it was just exhaustion. He'd been running from himself for 3 years, and he was tired. If something wanted him, let it come. He'd already lost everything that mattered. He made it through the rest of the night by keeping every light in the house on and checking the locks every 30 minutes. The footprints were still there at dawn, but the water had dried, leaving only the impressions and a faint smell of rot. Marcus took photographs with his phone, then went about his morning maintenance routine with mechanical precision. Diesel levels, radio check, weather observation. If he was going to lose his mind, he'd at least do it while maintaining professional standards. The VHF crackled to life around noon. Cape Disappointment, this is Astoria Station, radio check. Marcus grabbed the handset. Astoria Station, Cape Disappointment, copy you loud and clear. Good to hear you, Marcus. How's the first night treating you? The voice belonged to Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the district coordinator who'd arranged his assignment. She sounded cheerful and distant, speaking from a world where drowned sailors stayed drowned. Quiet, Marcus said. Then, because he couldn't help himself, found Daniel Cortez's journal. Interesting reading. A pause. Then, yeah, we were hoping someone would find that. Listen, Marcus, Daniel was a good keeper. Solid guy. But the isolation got to him. Started seeing things, hearing things. The mind plays tricks when you're alone too long. He wrote about Draugr, walking dead from Norwegian folklore. Another pause, longer this time. The area has a lot of Scandinavian heritage, fishing communities, old superstitions. Daniel spent too much time reading local history, got himself spooked. That's all it was. His footprints are still here. What? His boat was found drifting, but his footprints are still here. At least someone's footprints, bare feet, leading from the water to the lighthouse, and then they just stop. The radio crackled with static. When Sarah spoke again, her voice had lost its cheerful edge. Marcus, you need to tell me right now if this assignment is going to be a problem. We can have someone else out there by tomorrow. He wanted to say yes, wanted to tell her to send the replacement. But Tommy Westbrook's mother was screaming in his memory, and the sound of that scream had been defining his life for 3 years, and he was so goddamn tired of running. No problem, he said. Just thought you should know. Noted. Call if you need anything. Astoria Station out. Marcus spent the afternoon searching the property. He found more footprints, dozens of them, in the mud around the cliff edge, all barefoot, all leading to and from the water. He found pieces of driftwood carved with symbols that looked like angular runes. He found kelp arranged in patterns that might have been random or might have been deliberate. And as the sun began to set, he found something else. A hand, reaching up from between 2 rocks at the base of the cliff. Pale and bloated, fingers splayed as if grasping for purchase. Marcus scrambled down the rocks, nearly falling twice, his breath coming in harsh gasps. He reached the hand and grabbed it, ready to pull, ready to find a survivor somehow trapped in the rocks. The hand was cold. Not human cold. Stone cold. He pulled anyway, and what came free wasn't an arm, but a piece of driftwood carved and shaped to look exactly like a human hand. The detail was exquisite. Fingernails, knuckles, even the lines of the palm visible in the weathered wood. Someone had spent hours creating it. Someone with skill and patience and a very specific purpose. Marcus dropped it and backed away, looking up at the lighthouse tower above him. The light was beginning its rotation, that reliable 8-second pulse. Every 8 seconds, illumination. Every 8 seconds, darkness. And in one of those darkness intervals, he saw them. 7 figures standing at the top of the cliff, watching him, naked and gray and absolutely still. The light rotated back, and they were gone. Marcus climbed. He didn't remember making the decision to climb, didn't remember his hands finding holds in the rock, didn't remember anything but the animal need to get higher, to get away from the water. He hauled himself over the cliff edge and lay gasping on the grass, his jacket torn, his hands bleeding from the rough stone. When he looked up, one of the figures was standing 10 feet away. It had been a man once. Marcus could see that much. Middle-aged, probably, with a broad chest and thick arms. But the skin was wrong. Not just pale, but translucent in places, showing suggestions of bone and decay beneath. The eyes were the worst. Not empty, not glazed. Aware, intelligent, hungry. The thing opened its mouth, and seawater poured out, streaming down its chest and pooling at its feet. It took a step forward, then another, moving with the wrong kind of fluidity, joints bending in directions they shouldn't. Marcus scrambled backward, his hand closing on something, the wooden hand he'd dropped. He threw it without thinking, watched it bounce off the creature's chest with a sound like hitting wet meat. The thing didn't react, just kept coming. Then the lighthouse beam rotated across them, and the creature stopped. It turned its face toward the light, mouth still open, water still streaming. It raised one hand to shield its eyes, a gesture so human it was obscene coming from something so clearly dead. The light moved on, and the creature looked back at Marcus. But it didn't advance. It just stood there at the edge of the beam's reach, waiting. Marcus understood. The light was a barrier, not a permanent one. Nothing about this felt permanent, but enough to give him space. He got to his feet slowly, keeping his eyes on the creature, and backed toward the lighthouse. The thing watched him go. When Marcus reached the tower door, he could see the others emerging from the darkness, moving into a loose circle around the building. 7 figures, just like Daniel had written. He got inside and locked the door, then climbed the spiral stairs to the lamp room. The Fresnel lens turned in its housing, the electric motor humming with mechanical indifference. Outside, pressed against the glass, were faces. Not quite human faces anymore, teeth too visible through eroded lips, eyes too wide. Hands leaving wet prints on the glass as they pushed and scratched, testing the barrier. Marcus's phone had no signal this high up. The VHF radio in the lamp room was for emergencies only, monitored by the Coast Guard. He grabbed the handset. Astoria Station, Cape Disappointment, emergency, I need immediate extraction. Static. Then Sarah's voice, sharp with concern. Marcus, what's happening? They're here. The things Daniel wrote about. They're real. I need you to send someone now. Marcus, listen to me. You're experiencing a psychological episode. This is exactly what happened to Daniel. The isolation, the stress, your history with the Astoria incident. I'm not crazy, he was shouting now, his voice cracking. There are 7 of them. Dead men, drowned sailors, they're trying to get in. Marcus. Sarah's voice was calm, professional, the voice she'd probably used to talk someone off a ledge. No one is there. I need you to go back to the keeper's house, take some deep breaths, and we'll have someone out there first thing in the morning to relieve you. He looked out the window. One of the creatures was standing directly in the light beam now, letting it wash over its decomposing features. It smiled at Marcus, showing black gums and teeth like broken shells. Then it turned and walked away, melting back into the darkness. They're leaving, Marcus said quietly. Good. That's good. Now go inside, lock the doors, and try to get some rest. Can you do that for me? He wanted to tell her she was wrong, wanted to explain that what he'd seen was real, was documented in Norwegian folklore going back centuries, was the fate of anyone who died in the ocean with unfinished business. But he could hear it in her voice. She thought he was broken. Just another Coast Guard washout who couldn't handle the isolation. Maybe she was right. Yeah, he said. I can do that. He went back to the keeper's house and locked himself inside, then sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's journal open in front of him. He read every entry 3 times, looking for some detail he'd missed, some warning or instruction or explanation for what was happening. The last entry kept drawing his attention. The debt is us. What debt? What had Olaf Christensen meant when he screamed about gods and payment? Marcus thought about the Vandalia, About a Norwegian sailor warning of danger and being thrown in the brig for his trouble. About the ship going down anyway, all hands lost. About that sailor drowning while his warnings went unheeded. If you believed the folklore, and Marcus was rapidly running out of reasons not to. The Draugr were created by violent death and unfinished business. They were the dead who refused to stay dead, who walked the boundaries between water and land, who hungered for the living. But they weren't random. They had purpose. They had rules. The light kept them back, at least partially. They came at night. They moved with intelligence, with strategy. They were hunting him. The question was why. He spent the next 3 days in a state of hypervigilance that made his Coast Guard deployment look relaxed. He didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. He kept every light in the house burning constantly, even during the day. He did his maintenance duties with methodical precision, checking and rechecking every piece of equipment, as if being a good keeper would somehow protect him from what was coming. Because something was coming. He could feel it building, the way you could feel a storm approaching before the first clouds appeared on the horizon. The creatures appeared every night, sometimes 7, sometimes more. They stood at the edge of the light's reach and watched him. Sometimes they tried the doors and windows, testing for weaknesses. Once he woke at 3 a.m. to find one of them standing in his bedroom doorway, but when he turned on the lamp, there was nothing there except wet footprints leading from the door to the bed and back again. On the 4th night, he was checking the lamp room when he heard singing. It came from the ocean, rising and falling with the wind, a chorus of male voices singing in a language he didn't understand. Norwegian probably, or Old Norse. Something ancient. The harmony was beautiful and terrible, full of longing and rage and grief that had aged into something worse than either. Marcus pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound came through anyway, worming into his skull. He could feel it pulling at something inside him, creating a hunger he didn't understand. The hunger to join them, to stop fighting, to walk down to the water and let it take him. He remembered Astoria then. Remembered going down the 3rd time with Tommy Westbrook's jacket in his hands. Remembered the peace he'd felt when his lungs filled with water, the sense of letting go. They'd pulled him back to the surface, pumped the ocean out of him, brought him back from wherever he'd been going. But part of him had never left that dark place. Part of him was still down there, drifting, waiting. The singing was calling to that part. Marcus staggered down the spiral stairs, away from the lamp room, away from the ocean's voice. He made it to the keeper's house and locked himself in the bathroom, running the shower as hot as it would go, letting the sound of falling water drown out the singing. He stayed there until dawn, until the voices faded and the sun came up gray and cold over the Pacific. He was making coffee when he found the timber. It was lying on the kitchen table, exactly where Daniel's journal had been. Marcus hadn't moved it, hadn't even known where Daniel had kept it. But there it was, ancient black wood covered in carved runes, still damp with seawater. He reached out to touch it, then stopped. Something in his rational mind was screaming warnings, but his hand moved anyway, fingers brushing the carved symbols. The wood was cold, and in the moment of contact, Marcus saw a ship foundering in massive swells, masts snapping like kindling, men screaming in Norwegian as the ocean poured through breaches in the hull. A sailor locked in the brig, chained to the bulkhead, water rising around him as he shouted prophecies and curses. That same sailor floating in the dark water after the ship went down, eyes open but unseeing, body drifting in the current. The sailor's eyes opening again, awareness, returning where there should be none, hands moving through the water with unnatural purpose. The lighthouse being built on the shore above the wreck site, light piercing down through the water, illuminating the bones and wreckage below. The drowned sailor surfacing, emerging from the waves, walking up onto the rocks, followed by others, dozens of others, all the dead from all the ships that had gone down in these cursed waters. Marcus jerked his hand away, gasping. The vision faded, but the understanding remained. The lighthouse was built on top of the Vandalia's wreck site. Every night the light shone down into the water, illuminating the place where Olaf Christensen and the other sailors had drowned. To the Draugr, that light was an insult, a reminder, a wound that wouldn't heal. They couldn't destroy the lighthouse. It was stone and steel, beyond their power to damage. But they could destroy the keepers, one by one, until the light went out and the darkness reclaimed what it had lost. The debt wasn't about payment. It was about erasure, about making this place inhospitable to the living, so that eventually, inevitably, the lighthouse would be abandoned and the dead could rest. Marcus sat down heavily, staring at the timber. He could leave. Should leave. He could call Sarah right now, admit to the psychological breakdown she clearly thought he was having, and be off this cursed rock by nightfall. Someone else would be sent. Someone else would face the Draugr. Someone else would probably disappear just like Daniel Cortez. Or he could stay. Could accept that this was where his running stopped. That he'd been drowning since Astoria, and the only question was whether he'd let it happen here or somewhere else. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. He spent the day preparing. He found Daniel's notes about the Draugr, the research he'd compiled from library books and internet searches before the isolation had made him stop trusting his own mind. The folklore was consistent across sources. Draugr were corporeal undead, far stronger than living men who inhabited the places of their death. They could be killed again, but only by specific means: decapitation, burning, or forcing them back into the earth. They feared light, but not enough to destroy them. They had purpose, and they would pursue that purpose with the patience of the dead. In Norway and Iceland, communities would perform rituals to lay the Draugr to rest. Burials at crossroads, stones placed on graves, offerings to appease the angry dead. But this wasn't Norway, and Marcus wasn't a shaman or priest. He was just a washed-up rescue swimmer with PTSD and survivor's guilt, trying to make amends for deaths he couldn't prevent. As night fell, Marcus made a choice that probably meant his death. He went down to the rocks where the footprints always started, carrying a lantern and a knife. He could see them gathering in the darkness, 7 figures, then 9, then more, emerging from the water like a tide of the dead. They moved toward him slowly, giving him time to run, testing him, waiting to see what he would do. Marcus set down the lantern and held up the knife. "Olaf Christensen," he said, his voice steady despite the terror singing in his blood. "I know what happened to you. I know about the Vandalia. I know you tried to warn them and they wouldn't listen." The figures stopped. One of them stepped forward, and Marcus recognized it as the first one he'd seen. The thing with the translucent skin and aware eyes. It opened its mouth, and instead of seawater, words came out, heavily accented English, each syllable scraped from a throat that shouldn't be able to speak. "You know nothing. I know you're angry," Marcus continued. "I know the lighthouse was built over your grave without permission or respect. I know you want it gone, but killing keepers won't accomplish that. The Coast Guard will just send more people. The light will keep burning, unless..." He took a breath, committing to the lie he was about to tell. "Unless we make a deal. You let me stay. Let me keep the light. And when my time here is done, I'll make sure no one replaces me. I'll convince them the lighthouse should be fully automated, Keeper's house demolished. I'll give you back your rest." The thing that had been Olaf Christensen studied him with those 2 intelligent eyes. Then it spoke again, and this time the words came easier. "Why should we believe you?" "Because I don't want to die," Marcus said simply. "And I don't want anyone else to die. We can end this. Right here, right now. 4 months. That's all I'm asking." The Draugr stood silent, and Marcus became aware of others emerging from the water behind them. More than 7 now, more than a dozen. 40 years of shipwrecks in these waters, and here were their victims, gathered and watching, waiting to see what their spokesman would decide. Finally, Olaf spoke. "Show us." "Show you what?" "Show us you understand. Show us you know what we are. What was done to us." Marcus understood then. They wanted acknowledgement. wanted someone to bear witness to their deaths, their suffering, their existence in this cursed half-life. He lowered the knife slowly and reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He opened the voice recorder. "My name is Marcus Holloway," he said, speaking clearly. "I'm the keeper at Cape Disappointment Light. On this date, I am formally acknowledging the presence of the Draugr, the walking dead from Norwegian folklore, who inhabit these waters. I recognize the wrong done to Olaf Christensen and the crew of the USS Vandalia, who died in these waters in 1853. I recognize the disrespect shown by building a lighthouse over their resting place. I recognize their right to be remembered and respected." He paused, then added, "And I recognize that I am alive only by their permission." He played back the recording. Let them hear his voice speaking the words. Then he looked at Olaf. "Satisfied?" The Draugr reached out with one pale hand. For a moment, Marcus thought it would grab him, drag him into the water. Instead, it touched his forehead gently. The flesh was cold and soft, like waterlogged meat. "4 months," Olaf said. "Then you leave, and you keep your promise." "I will. If you break it, we will find you. Distance means nothing to the drowned. We will find you wherever you go, and we will drag you down where no light reaches." "Understood." The Draugr withdrew then, backing away into the darkness and the surf. Within minutes they were gone, leaving only wet footprints and the smell of decay. Marcus stood there shaking, aware that he'd just made a bargain he had no authority to keep. When his 4 months ended, the Coast Guard would send another keeper. The light would continue, and the Draugr would know he'd lied. But that was a problem for future Marcus. Present Marcus had bought himself 4 months of life, and that was more than he'd expected to get. The rest of his assignment passed in uneasy peace. The Draugr still appeared at night, but they kept their distance, watching from beyond the light's reach. Marcus went about his duties, maintained the equipment, filed his reports. When Sarah Chen checked in on the radio, he told her everything was fine. Normal. Quiet. He didn't tell her about the recordings he was making, about the research he was compiling, about the detailed documentation of every encounter, every observation, every piece of evidence he could gather. He was building a case, though he wasn't sure yet what court would hear it. On his last day, Marcus stood at the edge of the cliff and looked out at the gray Pacific. Somewhere down there, beneath the waves, were the bones of the Vandalia and the men who died on her. Somewhere down there, Olaf Christensen was waiting to see if Marcus would keep his promise. He couldn't. He knew that. The Coast Guard would send another keeper and the cycle would continue, unless he did something drastic. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Sarah. "I need to report a safety concern about Cape Disappointment." "What kind of concern?" "Structural issues with the keeper's house, foundation damage from coastal erosion. I'm worried the whole building might slide into the ocean during the next big storm. I'm recommending immediate evacuation and that no replacement keeper be assigned until a full engineering survey is completed." It was a lie, but it was a useful lie. It would buy time, maybe enough time to make his real plan work. Over the next 2 weeks, after he'd returned to Portland, Marcus wrote a report. Not an official Coast Guard report, but something else. A detailed account of everything he'd experienced. Every encounter, every piece of folklore, every reasonable explanation for why the Lighthouse Keeper program at Cape Disappointment should be permanently discontinued in favor of full automation. He sent it to the Coast Guard, sent it to NOAA, sent it to the Washington State Historical Society, sent it to maritime archaeology departments at universities. He framed it as a cultural preservation issue, arguing that the site was of historical significance and that human presence was disrupting important underwater archaeology. He was shameless in his manipulation, playing to academic egos and bureaucratic caution. It worked. 3 months after he left Cape Disappointment, the Coast Guard announced that the keeper's house would be demolished and the lighthouse converted to full remote monitoring. No human presence required. The official justification cited budget concerns and technological advances, but Marcus knew the truth. His campaign had worked. He'd fulfilled his bargain. That night, he dreamed of cold water and pale hands. He dreamed of Olaf Christensen standing at the foot of his bed, seawater pooling on the floor. He dreamed the Draugr leaning close enough that Marcus could smell the ocean in its breath and whispering "a debt paid." When he woke, there were wet footprints leading from his bedroom door to the bed and back again, but nothing else. No threat, no violence, just acknowledgement that a promise had been kept. Marcus never went back to Cape Disappointment, never accepted another Lighthouse assignment. He got a job with a shipping company, desk work far from the ocean, and tried to rebuild something like a normal life. But on foggy nights, when the moisture in the air reminded him of spray from crashing waves, he would think about the Draugr, about Olaf Christensen and the crew of the Vandalia, about Daniel Cortez, who disappeared trying to run from what couldn't be escaped, and he would remember standing on those rocks with a lantern and a knife, making a bargain with the dead, would remember that the ocean kept its secrets, and sometimes those secrets kept you, would remember that there were debts in this world that could only be paid in terror and respect, and the courage to stand witness to horrors that most people would rather pretend didn't exist. The lighthouse still stood, its light still turned, but no keeper climbed its stairs or slept in its shadow. And on certain nights, fishermen passing Cape Disappointment reported seeing figures on the rocks below the tower. 7 of them, sometimes more, standing in a circle, facing the water, as still as the stones themselves, watching, waiting, remembering. And the ocean, indifferent and eternal, rolled on.